Underground. We timed our visit to Pendleton to coincide with the roundup and had managed to snag one of the very last hotel rooms in town. My husband was a big rodeo fan and was as excited as a little kid to be attending the famous Pendleton roundup. I myself was looking forward to the rodeo and very much enjoyed the Wild West feel of the town, but my biggest wish for this trip was to visit the famous, or should I say infamous, Pendleton Underground. According to the literature I'd read prior to the visit, Pendleton was a small village first settled in the 1860s or thereabouts by a fellow named Goodwin who built a station and a toll bridge. It was mostly a farming community in the beginning and didn't begin to boom until they found gold in the Blue Mountains. Then Pendleton became a stop for supply wagons, as well as an entertainment capital where miners could spend their hard-won gold and where cowboys and ranchers could come to drink, gamble in the 32 saloons, and visit one of the 18 bordellos. Chinese workers came in abundance to work in the mines or do business in town. They were not always welcome with the general populace, and so burrowed underground and began digging tunnels from business to business, cellar to cellar, living and working in the tunnels they had dug. It was estimated that Pendleton's the labyrinth of underground tunnels, dug by the Chinese between 1870 and 1930, wound for more than 70 miles underneath the town. Through the years, the Pendleton underground tunnels and rooms were used by Chinese workers, prohibitionists, opium addicts, ice cream stores, butcher shops, speakeasies, saloons, card parlors, and even a bowling alley. Rumors abounded about the underground. One story in circulation claimed that a pair of train robbers who used the tunnels to store their ill-gotten goods had died in the dark passages under an old house during a gun battle over the stolen gold. It's said that the ghosts of the robbers still haunt the place, and you can sometimes hear them crying, "It's my gold. Mine." I shivered in delight as I recounted the legend to my husband. Being more pragmatic than I, he just laughed at me. But he did agree to accompany me on the tour of the Pendleton Underground. In 1989, some of the tunnels were restored by enterprising business folks who rehabilitated them and created exhibits and mannequins to demonstrate the businesses that used to be located there. I picked up the phone at once and booked us on the very next tour. My husband laughed at me because I began bouncing on my toes and dancing around the hotel room as giddy as a child with excitement. I was worse than he was the first night of the roundup. After a quick lunch, we went to tour headquarters and gathered with a large group of people, old and young, couples and singles, all interested in the story of the mysterious tunnels beneath our feet. I commented softly to my husband that we were probably standing over a tunnel right now, and the tour guide heard me and confirmed that part of the underground was indeed under our feet. We saw a short film, and then we were out on the sidewalk and walking around a corner. We stopped there and the tour guide shared a short story about cowboys who stood on that very spot and called up to the working girls in the rooms above our heads. Then we went down a staircase and were underground, in a cellar that once housed a saloon. Mannequins of cowboys lounged around and played cards, and our tour guide took a place behind the polished bar and discussed the role of the saloon in the days of the gold rush. My husband was absolutely fascinated. I was listening with half an ear as I poked around the room and looked at the exhibits, trying to imagine what it was like to drink and play cards underground, a poke of gold in my pocket and a gun at my side. Then the tour moved on, and we entered a recreated Chinese laundry. And that's when I was hit with the first wave of not quite nausea. I swayed as my eyes swam with strange, out-of-focus colors. My stomach flip-flopped strangely, my spine went rigid, and the skin on my shoulders and arms prickled with goosebumps. For a moment, I could hear sounds of water swishing and a man's voice right by my ear said something in Chinese. I gasped and whirled, but no one was there. As suddenly as it had come, the nausea faded and my head was clear again. The room swam back into focus, and I realized that the rest of the tour had already moved next door into the recreated ice cream shop. I followed hurriedly, and my husband frowned a little when he saw me and motioned for me to keep up. Spooked by my experience, I stayed by his side as the tour guide discussed the use of this space for ice cream storage and then took us through a doorway into a long underground room full of small cots and benches. It was lined with windows that looked out onto a tunnel hallway, which was lit in the daytime by glassed-in openings in the sidewalk above. A demonstration of the famous Pendleton wool industry had been set up here, but I heard nothing except the buzzing in my head as broken bits of words and phrases swept over me. Then my stomach turned over as strange bits of color flashed first here and then there in the room. For a brief moment, I saw an almost invisible Chinese man doing calculations on an abacus made of some kind of black wood. The hands, the only clear part of the man, were rapidly moving red beads back and forth on little wooden bars. "Come on, Sally. Don't lag behind," my husband said impatiently, pulling at my hand. Instantly, my vision cleared and I was back in the present. I staggered a little as I followed my husband through the door and into the tunnel itself. It was well constructed of dark basalt stones, smooth fairly flat on the outside and carefully mortared together. You could see through the large windows right back into the room where we had just been standing. I glanced toward the place where I had seen the hands holding the abacus, shuddered once, and resolutely kept my eyes forward as we navigated around a corner and into the next area. We passed through a place where a thriving butcher shop had conducted their business. I blinked cautiously as I looked around the room, but everything stayed in focus, for which I was grateful. It was fascinating to see the old posters advertising low prices for meat, the old-style cash register, and the cold room where the meat was kept. I was feeling much more myself now, and had thrust away the odd occurrences to think about when we were above ground. Then I stepped into the next room, an old card room that had been used as a bar during Prohibition, and heard an alarm bell jangling desperately from somewhere overhead. In front of me was the recreated scene of a card party with rough-looking fellows sitting around a table, eyeing each other suspiciously. Above the mannequins, a little bell was still vibrating a little, as if the string that activated it had just been pulled. No one else seemed to notice the vibrating bell or the sound of feet thudding rapidly for an exit that filled my ears. By now, I was so tense with superstitious dread that I felt as if I'd been punched in the stomach. My husband noticed my distress and whispered, "Are you all right?" I nodded slightly, unable to speak, and gratefully followed the rest of the tour down another tunnel and into a brighter room once used as a bowling alley. Then we were back on the street in the fresh air, and I was panting with combined fear and exhaustion. What was happening to me? Was I losing my mind? My husband was truly concerned by this time. "You look ill, honey," he said. "Do you want to go back to the hotel? We can take the rest of the tour another day." "I'm fine," I snapped a little sharply. How could I explain to my pragmatic husband that I was seeing things in the tunnels? He'd put it down to tiredness or say I was coming down with something. And maybe he'd be right. The tour was heading down the street now, toward the old bordello, which was the next stop, and I determinedly followed. My husband shrugged and came with me, taking hold of my hand and eyeing me sideways once in a while to make sure I was all right. We climbed the steps to heaven and toured the rooms of the old bordello without any distressing color flashes or visions on my part, though I thought my husband's eyes would pop out when he saw some of the decorations on the walls. Then we were at street level again, watching our guide open the locked door leading to our last stop on the underground tour. I started to shake slightly at the thought of going back underground. We were going to see a Chinese jail just below our feet. Apparently the Chinese did their own policing in the early days. I drew in a deep breath and followed my husband downstairs into a musty room filled with bunk beds and tables and a cooking stove. There were butas on the top shelf by the stove and Chinese hats. A gong hung next to me, and as I looked at it, the not quite nausea swept over me and the tour guide's voice faded away. I stared at the gong in a cowardly manner, listening to Chinese being spoken by several male voices, conversing leisurely with one another. I heard someone laugh a merry sound and finally looked around at a merry-faced man cooking something over a stove that looked and did not look like the one in the recreation. Behind him, a group of men sat around a table playing mahjong, and another man was lighting incense before a little altar in the corner. It was all so clear that for a moment I thought I could walk right up to the table and join the game. Then my husband's voice cut through the scene, urging me along, and we went into a small side room once used as an opium den. I stared for a long moment at the old platform where the opium users once lay smoking their pipes, almost willing myself to see them. But all I saw was an old opium bed, nothing more. And then the tour was over, and we were back at tour headquarters, thanking our guide, buying a souvenir book, and heading out into the street. As we walked back toward the car along the crowded street, I looked at one of the purple glass windows in the sidewalk that helped light the tunnels below. In my mind, I saw a pair of hands busy with an abacus. I'd never been psychic before, but I was convinced in that moment that I had truly seen back into the past during my time in the tunnels below Pendleton. Glancing up at my pragmatic husband, I wasn't sure what I should tell him, if anything. Would he believe me? I still was not sure I believed it myself, and it had happened to me. Maybe I'd tell him later. What's next on the roundup schedule? I asked him and watched his face light up. We headed away from the past and its ghosts and into the future. Werewolf's Bride. There once was a beautiful girl engaged to a soldier who caught the eye of an evil woodsman who had sold his soul for the ability to turn himself into a wolf at will. He lay in wait for the girl when she was walking home one day and accosted her, begging her to elope with him. The maiden refused, spurning his love and crying out to her love to save her from his advances. The girl's cries were heard by her eager fiancé, who had come searching for her when she was late returning to her parents' home. The soldier drove the woodsman away, threatening him with dire consequences if he ever approached the maiden again. The furious woodsman lay low for a few days, waiting for his chance. It came on the girl's wedding day. She was dancing happily at her wedding reception with a group of her friends when the woodsman, in the form of a wolf, leapt upon her and dragged her away with him. The enraged bridegroom gave chase, but the wolf and his bride had disappeared into the thick forest and were not seen again. For many days, the distraught soldier and his friends, armed with silver bullets, scoured the woods, searching for the maiden and her captor. Once the soldier thought he saw the wolf and shot at it. Upon reaching the location, he found a piece of a wolf's tail lying upon the ground. But of the wolf to which it belonged there was no sign. After months of searching, his friends begged him to let the girl go and get on with living. But the soldier was half mad with grief and refused to give up. And that very day, he found the cave where the werewolf lived. Within it lay the preserved body of his beloved wife. The girl had refused the werewolf's advances to the very end and had died for it. After his murderous fury had died away, the werewolf had tenderly laid the body of the girl he had loved and had killed into a wooden coffin where it would be safe from predators, and he came to visit her grave every day. Lying in wait for him, the soldier shot the werewolf several times as he entered the cavern, chasing him down until the maddened and dying werewolf leapt into the lake and disappeared from view. The soldier sat by the lake with his gun, staring into the rippling waters for hours as the catfish ate the bloody bits of the wolf that were floating on the surface of the water. When his friends found him, the soldier's mind was gone. He babbled insanely about a werewolf that had been eaten by a catfish when it leapt into the water, and he sobered only long enough to lead the men to the body of his beloved before he collapsed forevermore into insanity. He died a few days later, and was buried beside his bride in a little glen where they had planned to build their house. Their grave is long forgotten, and the place where it stands is covered with daisies in the spring. But to this day, the people of the area have a prejudice against eating catfish, though no one remember why. Whirlwind. In hindsight, I suppose it wasn't a good idea to go ancestor hunting in the local cemetery at dusk, but that's when my friends and I got the notion, so off we went as soon as we thought of it. My mother had told me we had kin in the cemetery, but I never visited there before. We got on our bikes and skimmed expertly through the tourists who thronged the streets of Key West in the winter. It was getting dark when we skidded to a halt and parked our bikes by the gate. "This is a pretty spooky place," my friend Amanda said uneasily, brushing blonde hair nervously from her forehead. It's not hard to scare Amanda, so Terry and I brushed off her comment with a laugh and headed in among the headstones. The shadows were long and growing darker by the second as we started reading surnames, trying to locate my kin. The Spanish moss dripping from tree branches overhead thrashed like writhing snakes in the sea breeze, reminding me a bit of the tale of Medusa. I shuddered a bit and then scolded myself for being a scary cat like Amanda. "Here's one," Terry called, beckoning me over to a rather dilapidated old tomb. I wandered over to take a look. By now, it was so dim I had to plaster my face up against the stone to read it. The dates looked correct. "This may be one of my great-grandparents," I said, straightening. I could barely see Amanda, who was in another aisle of the graveyard. A chill breeze sprang up, whipping the hair from my neck and making goosebumps rise on my arms. It really was spooky in here. "We need a flashlight," I said to Terry, who was trying to read the grave next to my great-grandparents' tomb. "Susan." Amanda called my name suddenly. I looked over at her and gasped suddenly, my body freezing in disbelief. A whirlwind full of dead leaves and dust was growing up from the ground in front of Amanda, and she staggered backward from it, hair and clothes whipping about from the ferocity of the breeze it created. A sepulchral voice rose out of the whirlwind, roaring wordlessly in rage. The sound rose higher and higher, making my hair stand on end. Beside me, Terry gave a sudden shout and sprang back toward the cemetery gates. "Come on," she called over her shoulder to me and Amanda. I forced my legs into action, sprinting after Terry. But when I glanced back, I saw that Amanda had tripped over a low tombstone and lay directly in the path of the shrieking whirlwind. I raced back and grabbed her arm, trying to get her moving again. She gasped and scrambled, but fear made her clumsy and she fell again over the jagged stone, cutting her knee open. The blood spurting from the cut was suddenly illuminated by a bluish light that appeared directly above the whirlwind. It coalesced rapidly into a glowing man in the garb of an old-time Spanish settler. The spirit gave a shout of rage at the sight of us and swooped toward us, arms outstretched. Amanda gave a shriek and found her feet at last, racing away from the ghost so fast she left me far behind. I sprinted after her, my way uncannily lit by the glowing phantom behind me. The air around me was ice cold and it made my lungs ache as I ran. I leapt over a tombstone standing between me and the gate, where Amanda and Terry were already on their bikes. "Hurry, Susan! Hurry!" Terry shouted. I raced through the gates and stumbled into my bike, knocking it over. As I grabbed it off the ground, I risked a backward glance and saw the phantom hovering just inside the gate, the whirlwind somehow mixing in with his glowing form. Dust whipped into my face as I jumped onto my bike and followed my fleeing friends. By the time we reached the end of the street, the phantom had vanished and the whirlwind had died away. We kept going. Terry's house was the closest, so we rode there and collapsed on her porch, panting. "There is no way I'm ever going back to that cemetery," Amanda gasped. "What was that thing?" I shook my head, but Terry said, "I heard that the ghost of the man who single-handedly drove all the pirates out of Key West haunted the cemetery, but I thought it was just a myth. You know, one of the stories you tell to tourists to freak them out." "Worked for me," I jibed. "I am completely freaked." Beside me, Amanda groaned in agreement and poked gently at her bloody leg. Terry blinked, realizing for the first time that she was wounded. We hustled her inside the house to clean up her knee. Then I rode home with Amanda because she refused to go anywhere alone. I didn't blame her. It was full dark when I headed back to my house. I stayed on the main roads, trying to keep out of the shadows. In my mind, I kept seeing the glowing figure swooping at me and feeling the supernatural coldness piercing my lungs. I decided then and there that I had enough ancestor hunting. From now on, I am staying away from that graveyard.